From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Today's lecture is presented by the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. The Kluge Center is a vibrant scholar center on Capitol Hill that brings together scholars and researchers from around the world to stimulate and energize one another, to distill wisdom from the library's rich resources, and to interact with policymakers and the public. The center offers opportunities for senior scholars, postdoctoral fellows, and PhD candidates to conduct research in the Library of Congress collections. We also offer free public lectures, conferences, symposia, and other programs, and we administer the Kluge Prize, which recognizes outstanding achievement in the humanities and social sciences. For more information about the Kluge Center, I encourage you to visit our website, loc.gov/Kluge, and I invite you to sign up for our RSS email list to learn about future programs and opportunities for you to conduct your own research here at the library. Today's program is titled It from Bit, Cross-Cultural and Interdisciplinary Links in Modern Computing. It features Senior Librarian at the Library of Congress, Jennifer Baum Sevec, who is this year's Kluge Staff Fellow. While at the Kluge Center, Baum Sevec has been using items from the Library of Congress collections in order to identify cross-cultural and interdisciplinary contributions to modern computing. Her work at the library primarily focuses on the areas of access metadata, special collections acquisitions, strategic and digital initiatives, business systems analysis, and web development. She holds an MA in Religion Cultural Studies and is an MS candidate in Information Technology and Informatics at the University of Maryland. Her work on the art exhibit, The Holy Art of Imperial Russia, continues to travel as an art installment at various museums throughout the United States. Jennifer's research is the latest example of the work that Kluge Staff Fellows do in helping us to understand the world around us. The library staff is full of brilliant and esteemed colleagues who are passionate about their areas of expertise, and the Staff Fellowship allows one or sometimes two such staff members the opportunity each year to conduct independent research using the library's collections in pursuit of their scholarship. Funded by the gift left by the late John W. Kluge to found the Kluge Center, the Staff Fellow is one of the nearly 100 scholars who pass through our walls each year, creating the vibrant Scholars Center on Capitol Hill that we know as the John W. Kluge Center. It has been our great privilege to have Jennifer with us as this year's Kluge Staff Fellow for the past 6 months. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jennifer Baum Sevec.
Thank you, Jason, for that very warm welcome. This is an excellent crowd. I'm really pleased to see so many familiar and some new faces as well. So thank you for coming on such a gorgeous day in Washington. I would be remiss to not thank the myriad of people who made this fellowship possible. I'm very grateful to Mr. John W. Kluge for his generous gift and vision to ensure a staff fellowship at the center. The Kluge Center staff welcomed me from the outset, and they have been wonderful. I thank you all. Interim Director Bob Gallucci, Mary Lou Rieker, Travis Hensley, Jason Steinhauer, Joanne, Anastasia, Dan, Emily, Denise, all of you, thank you for your support. To ABA Director Beecher Wiggins, USAN Chief Linda Geisler, Associate Librarian of Library Services Mark Sweeney, and the division staff, particularly of the U.S. Anglo Division, and I would be absolutely remiss if I did not thank the U.S. Monographs team for carrying the load while I was gone, so I very much appreciate your support. I also need to thank Dr. Katrin Weller. She was a former Digital Studies Fellow at the Center, and two of our former Library of Congress colleagues, Dr. Trevor Owens and Ms. Bridgetta Jenkins, whose support provided me sufficient courage to apply for the fellowship. There's also unfailing support from all of the colleagues throughout the library. There's just too many of you to name. Many of you are here right now. It's been extraordinary. To the Kluge Fellows, your inspiring work, collegiality, marvelous interdisciplinary engagement has been incredibly rewarding both professionally and personally, so thank you very much. And last, at the risk of being braggadocious, and since you gave me a podium, I'm going to say it. I'm clearly biased here. The Library of Congress arguably has some of the best, most resourceful, dedicated staff in the world. The collections are unparalleled. New acquisitions, including digital materials, are continuously being added for greater public access. The extensive work done out front and behind the scenes provides an incredible experience that's incomparable. To engage in knowledge spanning millennia in all formats, in nearly all subject matters, in over 470 languages. For those of you who are considering a fellowship here or are interested in research at this great library, the world's largest, consider this your personal invitation. We're open. I have the great pleasure today to showcase some of the library's collections. That's one of the really unique things about the staff fellowship, is you really get to dig into the maze of goodies here and feature some of the treasures. Some of these I helped acquire and make accessible, and I get to do all this while sharing a remarkable story. So without further ado, let's get to it. The title of the talk today, as you see, is It from Bit, Cross-Cultural and Interdisciplinary Links in Modern Computing. Looking at modern culture, is it known or well understood how our digital world was created? Do we understand how various theories, practices, innovations from different cultures and disciplines informed and helped others to flourish? What does it mean to be technically inspired? Fields of research tend to be rather isolated. Mathematics, physics, computer science, similar areas of study are thought to be independent of and not reliant on other fields of study, particularly the humanities. While the Renaissance is known for thinkers and doers adept in multiple fields of research, modern scholarship has distanced itself from such an approach. Although some scholarship addresses digital history and interdisciplinary work, the body of this scholarship is focused on technological advancements in the 20th and 21st centuries rather than cultural and multiple discipline contributions to the understanding of how our digital world formed prior to and during this time. The problem with this difference is twofold. First, I'm touching the thing. Sorry about that, that was my fault. Thank you, I'll stop touching the knobs. Okay, so first, bits and bytes have ancient interdisciplinary roots that are part of multiple fields of study, and that story must inform our present and future. I didn't touch it, I swear. Okay, so I'll just keep going. All right. Second, the humanistic inquiry and lure of innovation may appear to be independent of one discipline to another, yet they weave a more interconnected story, as well as demonstrate the pervasiveness of digital technologies in modern culture. I'm going to stop reading here very soon, but that part I wanted to get right. Rather than shying away from the interdisciplinary intertwining of ideas and interests of great inspirations and innovations over time, the research celebrates the breadth and depth of their formulation in a story that navigates from ancient foundations to modern-day technology. The importance of this study is to more fully address the how did we get here question, using Wheeler's observer-participant concept as a lens to examine it from bit, which I'll explain momentarily. The use of computers and other digital technologies is growing into a maturity while simultaneously catapulting into realms of advanced research and use previously not encountered. Misconceptions abound, and the complexity, scale, and volume of information add to the confusion. We wouldn't know anything about that here at the Library of Congress. This research looks deeply at the creative thinking that enabled innovation for calculation, storage, communication, and information with digital technologies that has substantive implications for the present and the future, for learning, discovery, cultural dynamics, and human understanding. The modern primary research sources of today, which range from podcasting and social media to email and satellite radio, must be understood in the context of their larger history. The existing discourse and research on digital history tends to leap from the abacus to Leibniz to Boole and Babbage and to Shannon and Turing, among many others. I need to say that today you really need to take note that there are going to be key people and innovations and contributions to computing that will be missing from the lecture today. In fact, it was a little painful to cut out so much due to time. The point was not to cover history comprehensively, but to add to the scholarly discourse in ways that had not been well studied beyond the known history. The exploration of how these ideas developed is demonstrated by three themes, which is new research on that lens of it from bit. First, there were galvanizing ideas from cross-cultural and interdisciplinary links at pivotal moments, which we'll talk about some of those, that people from various cultures and disciplines asked similar questions and actively observed those questions and participated in work for understanding what those questions meant, that these ideas and the work and the understandings formed foundational concepts in modern computing. So I went about this asking two research questions. One, what cultural and topical developments laid the groundwork for digital technologies in the 20th and 21st century, and what are some of the pivotal theories, practices, innovations from various cultures and disciplines that enable digital technologies to flourish? I'll eventually be able to speak. Okay, so getting into Wheeler. In February 1990, there was a preprint issued from the physics department of Princeton and the University of Texas. And John Archibald Wheeler wrote, the title of it was Information, Physics, Quantum, and the Search for Links. The phrase, it from bit, stems from this work asking the age-old metaphysical question, how come existence? Wheeler offered an information theory based on Claude Elwood Shannon's work, which we'll get to in a bit, pun intended. So Wheeler theorized that every particle, every field of force, even the space-time continuum itself, derives its function, its meaning, its very existence entirely, even in some contexts indirectly, from the apparatus elicited answers to yes or no questions, binary choices, or bits. So you may be asking yourself, what is the apparatus elicited? The way I'm interpreting that is this whole concept of binary, the whole choice of yes or no, 0, 1, it is or it isn't, okay? Now, I was struggling a little bit to try to figure out a way to graphically represent this, and I used the smart graphics from PowerPoint, which may or may not work here, but in a way I think it does work. When you look at Wheeler's theory, the bit is sort of everything and one thing all at once, but it's comprised of all of its parts. So you have all of these cross-cultural and interdisciplinary influences that lead to this bit that is both, it's simultaneously physical, philosophical, and cultural. It'll make more sense as we go through, hopefully. The cross-cultural links that I discovered in this research kind of surprised me. Some of these I really knew, and then some of them I didn't. You'll see here that there's a lot of countries and peoples that are involved. These are just some that touch on my research, but there are others that I just didn't get to. As far as the interdisciplinary links, you'll see it's pretty expansive. And some I even learned just a few weeks ago, so it was kind of interesting to have those pop up towards the end. And I think what's also compelling here is that when all of these disciplines work together, sometimes they work together, sometimes they were working separately, but they were informing one another, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, and then it led to new disciplines, things like chaos theory, computer science itself, computer-generated art with CGI, and many of you are familiar with that with film, genetics, information science, and more. So every day for the past almost 6 months, when I would come into this great building, I would look up at the Jefferson Building and I would notice the architecture. And I just had to throw this in because it made me laugh every single day I came to work. And I did look for a Carol Highsmith photo of this, and I did not find one, to my surprise, because we have almost every other picture from her other than this. I still didn't touch the button. Okay, so what made me laugh at this picture is I kept thinking, when I give this presentation, everyone is going to stare at me going, what are you talking about? And then as I would go to the cafeteria, people would say, well, make sure whatever you're talking about is something I can understand. And so this was sort of the expression I thought people would have out there in the audience as I was talking, like, what is she saying? So if this very idea of binaries and bits and bytes gives you sort of a glazed or dazed facial expression, just know you're not alone. A lot of people have had that thought. We're not really going to go into the weeds, so to speak, on some of that, but there's some fundamental concepts that are pretty easy to understand. And just remember that you use binary and bits every single day. If you have one of these, one of your cell phones, if you use one of these, if you use a barcode of any kind, there are no librarians in here that would be using barcodes, I'm sure. We use bits every single day. Okay. So moving on, because we're talking about bits and we're talking about zeros and ones, I feel a little obligated to go back in time here. This is a really fantastic write-up if you haven't had a chance to look at it from the World Digital Library, which a lot of that great work is done here at the Library of Congress. And there is a wonderful description here from a former distinguished visiting scholar of the Kluge Center. And here you'll see there's some markers here of understanding when the zero came into being. You have the 300 BCE Mesopotamia, you can see where that is if you're not familiar. And the understanding when the zero marker comes into place, the idea of number shift, and the idea that one following zero really beginning in India and their number system, and then the whole idea of 1 through 9 being able to, with 0, being able to represent any number of infinite number combinations. So then we move into around 846, and I'm not going to attempt this name because this is not my language of expertise. If it was Russian, I'd have a better shot at it, but I don't. But it's important to understand that this individual, whose work was translated into Latin at about that same time, is really well understood to have coined the terms algebra and algorithm, which again we use in everything with computing, but in almost everything else also. So we jump then to 952, and I'm going to attempt this one out. Euclides invents the decimal point in Damascus, and that's a take on basically what they think is someone who was teaching Euclid at the time. So this is a adopted name of someone who was teaching Euclid. Okay, so that's just getting a little bit of our bearings. But going back even further, it was interesting for me, especially someone who taught religion at the University of Florida for several years and taught religions of Asia, where you would learn about yin yang and Taoism, and you would talk about the I Ching, the Book of Changes. I was always taken with the idea of trigrams, hexagrams, and then you can imagine my delight when, in doing research, I came across something that was in Scientific American, and it's dated 1885. Excuse me, this is Popular Science Monthly. Where they were looking at those trigrams, and basically any of on the lower part of your screen where you have the lines going either all the way across or part of the way across, the ones that go all the way across stand for the 0, and then the ones that go just part way across are ones, and it may be a little blurry on yours, but underneath each of those are actually the binary equivalent. So it should say something like, 0, 0, 0, and then 0, 0, 0. I actually said that backwards. So the short ones are 0, and then the long ones are 1. And then it goes and so on. So they're in binary order. So even in 1885, people were looking at this type of connection. 19th century, well before the 20th, 21st century. I'm going to make just a passing mention of this just because it comes up a lot in the literature, and I don't know if our very own John Hessler is here. If he is, he can tell you a lot more about this than I can, but I kept coming across this concept of the quipu. During the Incan Empire, the idea of recording information with strings and knots. And there's a lot of discussion, particularly by Professor Gary Urton of Harvard. He's got a whole database on these. See some nodding from our very own anthropologist, It's tough to say that this is a binary system, and I'll tell you why. One, we don't have what's the equivalent of the Rosetta Stone. We don't have something that says, this is what this means. There's no translation or correlation necessarily set. I think what we can say is that whatever this ends up being, and we hope to find out one day, it is clear that it has binary opposition. Kind of calling in a little bit of Levi-Strauss here. But you have different colors of string. You either have a white string or you have a colored string, binary opposition. You either have a knot or you don't. The knot goes one direction or it goes the other direction. But because you have all of these different parts, it's not exactly binary because it's a lot of extra stuff. So I throw it in there because it's a concept that was happening very early that is very similar to, again, what we use in modern computing. And one of the other ones I'll talk about is from an island in French Polynesia, Mangareva. I got a clap on that one, that's fantastic. So it's really not imperative to understand the math here, and I won't bore you to death with that. I'm not sure everyone would be excited about that, but what I think was compelling for me about this was that the population of people here came in 3 different waves, and well before colonialism came. And the research is pretty clear that during the second wave, when you had people coming from the Southeast Marquesas, that there was an interesting mathematical system that had a superposition situation. So you'd have a binary system and you'd have a decimal system. We need both of those in order to use computers, in order to make calculations more efficient, to do addition and not have to go in depth with multiplication. This system would allow you to do that without notation, without having to write it down, without having to have a calculating machine. Very early, very complicated, and the concepts were there. And these were all things that Leibniz noted much later, centuries later. Okay, so speaking of Leibniz, I thought it was really interesting too to learn a little bit about him. We hear a lot about him if you study math or if you study computer science, but I didn't know that he was once a librarian, and I learned that he was a historian. He was a whole lot of different things besides philosopher and mathematician. But when you look at what's next to his image here, you'll see that it's a version of his calculating machine, and it's going to look very reminiscent to what we fast forward to in the 20th century with Claude Elwood Shannon at Bell Labs. What we find later on is that the people who were most influential in information theory kept going back to some of these greats in mathematics and other fields. They were going back to Boole, they were going back to Babbage, they were going back to Leibniz, not necessarily in historical order, but you get the idea. Another area where we have a real connection, and I'm kind of jumping around just slightly, but I wanted to make sure that the I Ching got its due historically. Leibniz was in contact with a lot of people. He was traveling all around. He was trying to defend the claim to political structure in his home country of Germany. And he was in contact with a French Jesuit, Bouvet. And one of the things that this priest brought back was this brilliant view of the I Ching, and again, the trigrams, and then the understanding of binary notation. And I don't know if you can see it in the corners, but there are Arabic numbers. There's, I think it's 28 inverted and then 27 down at the bottom right. Those are in Leibniz's hands, and his hand. And basically what it did, it was allow him to kind of have this concept of universality with binary number systems. Became a very important concept for this understanding of having a universal communication, which is eventually what happens with computers. So some of you may be surprised to see Louis, and most of us in this country know it as Braille, but I've been educated to learn that it's actually Braille. And I found this fascinating to understand this is yet another binary system. You either have raised dots or you don't have raised dots. And that's kind of evident when you look at it, but as you think about these systems and wonder, geez, I don't really understand this, just think about how very straightforward some of this really is. There's a raised dot or there isn't. There's a 1 or a 0. Okay, so moving into Charles Babbage. Babbage is important for a lot of different reasons, and I'm not going to go into all of this because, again, the literature is pretty clear on his contributions. But he kept trying to figure out ways to improve calculation and to do it faster. You had so many people trying to memorize tables of information, data tables, and it just seemed like there had to be a way to automate this. His collaboration with, she's really well known as Ada Lovelace, but her full name is there, as you can read. She was the daughter of Lord Byron, and her mother was terrified that she would follow in her father's footsteps. So she received a very astute mathematical education, something that was very rare at the time. Ada was a programmer before programming was a thing. In fact, there's actually a programming language named for her. It's very similar to Pascal for any of those who you like to program. But she was able to articulate Babbage's work in a way that he wouldn't be able to do. She was able to have people understand that the algebra he was using could weave patterns, as she says so eloquently here, just like the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves. So it's the idea of taking this processing, programming something to record and transmit, to even calculate and share it. Not just to process it, but to share it. It was something that she only recently, only in the last 10 years or so, has really gotten credit for. But really why I had to put all of this in here was because I had to get to this whole concept of the jacquard loom. So this is sort of selfish on my part. So here you see a not a very attractive photo, or I mean image of Mr. Jacquard, but what he's important is his loom was the beginning of where you really started to see automation, where you'd see punch cards automating a process that was once very manual. Skilled craft work here, there's no doubt about it. And jumping further, this is why those 3 slides preceding are there, is to get to this. The Library of Congress acquired a book, this book, a few years ago, and it is one of the only, it's actually the first book to ever have been produced with, and I say automated in quotes, algorithm on a jacquard loom. It's really a very unassuming book. It's relatively small. It's woven entirely out of silk, and it was programmed entirely using punch cards. And you would never know it when you look at it. The weave and the weft is so tight, it looks perfect even all of these centuries later. This was also presented to a World's Fair shortly thereafter. And this is important because you're starting to spread information globally in ways that people hadn't really seen. The idea that you could have a book printed this way was just unheard of. So we're skipping ahead a little bit here to Mr. Morse, Samuel Finley Breeze Morse. And some of the manuscript division staff who are here, we've had several conversations about Mr. Morse. But I found it really interesting that he was an accomplished artist. He was actually, his parents really wanted him to go into the book trade, and he really just wasn't interested. And there were a lot of seminal moments in his career, but I think a few things just to mention in passing, since we are talking about interdisciplinary kind of contributions, is that, you know, he was trained as a painter. He was relatively good at it because he received commissions. The Marquis de Lafayette would be one, Noah Webster, there were others, but he couldn't make any money at it. And so he had to come up with something else to do. Also, interestingly enough, he, on a trip to France, I think actually going to meet the Marquis de Lafayette, met Louis Daguerre and was the first person essentially in the US to learn about the daguerreotype, come back, write it up about how do you do it, and then he taught Matthew Brady, who is probably the most well-known person to have created daguerreotypes in this country, especially for his work with the Civil War. And so this is actually daguerreotype, the larger image is a daguerreotype of Morse taken by Matthew Brady. And then that's just an example of one of his paintings. But really, what I'm here to talk to you about with Morse is just his technical creations. He had an unfortunate tragedy. His wife died relatively young, I mean by today's standards anyway, and he didn't know. He didn't know until after he went back home to visit, and she not only had died, but they'd already buried her. It was kind of sad, and so there was really no way to communicate information faster. Whether or not this was the impetus for his creation, I'm not sure we know exactly, but I think that's pretty good cause. So he started looking at ways of doing this, and there were a lot of different innovations that led up to him creating the electromagnetic telegraph, and it was a single wire system. But I think what's really remarkable about what he did was his system for Morse code. When you look at this image, what's going to come back, what we're going to come back to here is where you see this yellow arrow. It looks remarkably like pulse modulation. For anybody who's studied communications, and again, we're going to get into Shannon a little bit later, but you know, how you communicate a message across an electrical system, you have to be able to quantify that time in order to make that information be communicated, keep it together, so you go from one point to the other and have it received and have it all make sense. For anybody who's familiar with packet switching, it's the same kind of concept. You need to keep it all together. You have to control that time and that speed. And he was onto something here very early. Again, well before the 20th century, well before the 21st century. So also just to give you a sense, one of our resident experts who's now retired, Len Bruno, did a really interesting video that you can find on the library's website talking about that first transmission by telegraph, where he sent what had Goth Rot, is that right? Looking at the manuscript people, from Washington to Baltimore. But it's not just having done the transmission, it's also just how quickly and how widely the ability to transmit communication through telegraph happened. It was within 10 years that you had 50 or more different companies putting up new poles and trying to get the communications to really reach all across the country. But then it gets really interesting when he starts looking at the idea of going across the Atlantic. So here is Morse's sketch for an Atlantic cable stretch. And it's kind of ingenious. Again, when you start looking at it, it looks a lot like a relay. It starts to have aspects of a circuit. You know, it's pretty advanced for the time period. And again, you'll see some examples that are somewhat similar later. Another thing that's kind of compelling with the telegraph is it really starts to take the imagination of people. You know, here you're seeing a really beautiful image of a march that is the postal telegraph. I mean, who regularly has an invention that people want to set to music? It's pretty incredible. But there were a lot of them, and a lot of newspapers took their name, the something or other telegraph. We have the former chief of the Serial and Government Documents Division is nodding, saying, yes, we really do. We have tons of those. So it really started to take root in popular culture and the way that we thought about our communications. So we're in the same kind of time period, and we have the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Illinois in 1893. So many people are familiar with this, but the thing that There are several things that I thought were just really interesting about this. It was huge. I don't know if anybody in here has studied this very much, but it was absolutely enormous. They basically remade not only all of the area close to the shore, to Lake Michigan, but it was really supposed to create this ideal city, this white city. And the white city was not only the idea of urban development that hadn't quite managed to create its social constructs the way that people would like it to be, but it's also the idea of electricity, which we'll see in a few minutes. But one of the other things you see, especially with the official guide to the Midway Plaisance, is this idea of a highway through the nations. So you don't just have this exposition of, hey, here's our cool new invention, and here's what we're doing today, and are we a great country? But it was to share cultures throughout the world. And you can see in the next graphic, you have Uncle Sam and Lady Liberty basically welcoming everyone to the great city of Chicago so that they could have this kind of cultural exchange. There were 46 nations that participated in the exposition. The cost was around $28 million, so it wasn't cheap. For the admissions, there were about 21 million and change, and the admission price was 50 cents. Children under 12 paid 25 cents, and those who were under 6 were admitted for free. Prior to the opening, there was 72,000 tons of exhibit materials that were shipped to the grounds, and over 250,000 displays ranging from milk sterilization machines to works of art. And there were over 70,000 individual exhibitors. So it gives you a sense of the magnitude and the grandeur. It wasn't all fantastic from the cultural standpoint if we take our cultural awareness of today. And you can see this in the puck illustration here. You have a very tall Uncle Sam who is towering over all of the other nations, who've been characterized in a way that isn't maybe nice by today's standards. But for its day, the idea was that we're trying to, be together here and understand where we are in the world, okay? So moving on to the electricity building, which is, again, why I was really getting into this whole exposition in the first place, was it was really amazing when I started to go through the photographs and trying to understand, again, what are some of these seminal moments, what are some of these themes that are coming together? You can see that this is not a small building. It's enormous. So the image on the top was an artist rendering from Harper's of what the plan was supposed to be. And then the image on the bottom was an actual picture of what it looked like once it had been built. And they're just from slightly different angles, so that's one of the reasons why they look so different. But it was a grand and huge building. And then what was also interesting was that the entire place was lit up at night with electricity. For those of you who are familiar, the library has acquired a major PBS collection, WGBH. And they did a really great series on sort of the warring battle of electricity with Edison and Tesla. And it was Westinghouse and Tesla who lit the entire exposition. It was really incredible. But to give you an idea of the competition, and I laugh just because branding was everywhere. I mean, I don't know how they understood marketing as well as they did back then, but they nailed it. It's a little blurry because it's a lantern image, but down in the front, kind of where you see the triangle, you have Westinghouse and Tesla and the polyphase system, which was one of the motors he was creating. Behind that, you have Edison, and you see that that was with GE, and they have banners and they have huge signs, and all the way at the back of the building, you have the Westinghouse building, and so this was the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. I mean, it was just everywhere. Here we are, we're Westinghouse and we're Tesla. Here we are, we're GE and we're Edison. It was just everywhere. So the idea of these ideas being kept between the two of these gentlemen, battling it out, and their business supporters really was not the case at all. It was a global phenomenon that a lot of people were aware of. And I just had to tuck off onto the side there the little flag, it's kind of sad almost, for Gray's teleautograph. You know, by now we have the telegraph has been kind of global at this point, and they didn't stop with the inventions at that point. It's not just looking at the telegraph, it's how do we make it better? How do we make it print? I mean, one of the annoying things about the telegraph is you either have to be there to listen to it, do dots and dashes, or to sit there and write it down. Gray's idea was to actually have it do it for you. So again, it gets at this idea of automation. Also at this time, so we're looking at Tesla here again, and I'm going to read a little bit of this newspaper article that's from the Chronicling America site, also supported here at the Library of Congress program here. And I really think it's important, even though it came a little bit later, it was in 1915, because Tesla had some vision that a lot of times people just sort of thought he was a little crazy. And there were some good reasons why. I mean, he would stand there and let electricity radiate through his body and it would go all over the place. It was really kind of a sight. But he was arguably a genius and ahead of his time on many topics and many thoughts. So from this article, published in the Leavenworth Echo, and this is Leavenworth, Washington, by the way. It says, wireless vision seen by Tesla thinks world system will allow many to talk at once, ends static disturbance. We're going to come back to disturbance here in just a little while. The inventor also hopes to transmit pictures by same medium which carries the voice, declares it will be possible to hold secret conversation too. In perfecting the devices, there are two kinds. First, those serving to control transmission, and second, those magnifying the received impulses. So this should start to sound familiar. It is claimed that static disturbances will fatally interfere with the transmission, meaning that it won't happen. It'll just cut off. While as a matter of fact, there is no static disturbance possible in properly designed transmission and receiving circuits. Another contention is that there can be no secrecy in wireless telephone conversation. I say it is absurd, and this is quoting Tesla here. It is absurd to raise this contention when it is positively demonstrated by experiments that the Earth is more suitable for transmission than any wire could ever be. So he's referring to the electromagnetic qualities of the Earth. A wireless telephone conversation may be made as secret as a thought. By the same means, I propose also to transmit pictures and project images so that the subscriber will not only hear the voice, but see the person to whom he is talking. Pictures transmitted over wires is a perfectly simple art practice today. Many inventors have labored on it, but the chief credit is due to Professor Korn of Munich. So again, we have this intercultural exchange. Around the same time, you have a Yale alumnus and a Bell Labs physicist, Harry Nyquist, beginning to work on a method for transmitting pictures by wire, telephotography, as early as 1918. So this is only 3 years later. And the company had a working prototype by 1924. So now we're getting into the heart of the matter, information theory. And I forgot my little friend, so sorry about that. And really what this is we're moving from the idea of digits, how early cultures would count on your fingers and hands while we have count in base 10 as opposed to base 2. It's just easier. I mean, if we were a crabs or something, I live in Maryland, we know about crabs, then 2 would be easier, but it's not. We have 5 fingers on each hand and 10 seems to work pretty well. But the idea of getting into what we really consider digital of today really starts to take shape in this period. So it's just at the very beginning of the 20th century. But again, keeping in mind that there was a lot of seed laying, a lot of groundwork that had been laid leading up to this point. So I'm not going to go, all of these things could be their own research topic, and I just can't go into all of them today. But I want you to have sort of a mental picture. Imagine you're walking around places like Princeton at their advanced institute, and then not too long after you're walking around Bell Labs and you see the following people in the hallway, people who are the founding faculty. You see Einstein, you see Shannon, you see Turing. I mean, all of these names that you come to mind, Nyquist, just incredible people who were contributing to all of these thoughts and ideas over time. When Shannon was at Bell, it's not like on today where if you're a research candidate somewhere, unless you're established, you're not getting published. And Nyquist was in the same boat, as was Ralph Hartley. And one of the really cool things that Bell Labs did is they had their own journal where their own staff could publish in it. It was called the Bell Systems Technical Journal, and it was there that Claude Shannon learned of Harry Nyquist's work to understand the amount of data and speed transmitted by telegraph. So again, we're having people of 20th century keep going back to the telegraph, going back to Boole and understanding logic gates, going back to Babbage and understanding all of the calculations there. He converted the continuous waves into data that was discrete. It was digital, so a discrete system. You have to contain it to understand how it's going to move through electricity. Nyquist had devised a formula for the speed transmission of intelligence. And the circuits carried varying waves of frequencies, and the engineers, they were referring to it as bands. The range of frequency was understood as bandwidth, and would turn that measure and basically create a measure for circuit capacity. So to transmit intelligence at a certain speed, a measurable channel was needed. So again, we're in the same period. It's around 1927, and there's the centennial of Volta's death. And Ralph Hartley, who was known for his engineering work with radio, and he was also at Bell, wrote that information is a very elastic term, and what was needed was a measure in terms of purely physical quantities. He wrote the equation as h equals n log s, where h is the amount of information, n is the number of symbols transmitted, and s is the size of the alphabet. In 1945, Shannon wrote a report, A Mathematical Theory of Cryptography, which was classified practically immediately thereafter and is part of the collection we have here at the library in the manuscript division. But in that, he makes several what I think are astounding points. That a secrecy system is almost identical to a noisy system. That information theory, which is a new phrase, hadn't been used until now. And that term was needed in order to get beyond the elastic use of information and to define it physically. And that information is basically binary digits or bits. It's closely associated with uncertainty, which can be measured by counting the possibility of messages. So again, we get back into things like packet switching and understanding how to measure a circuit and bandwidth and all of those goodies. It implies a surprise in the sense of probabilities. So how do you work with all of that unknown? You start looking at probabilities. What is significant is, and this is, again is a quote from Shannon, is that the difficulty in transmitting the messages from one point to the other. It's not so much the message. While the message eventually becomes important in a lot of ways, it's really how do you get it there? How do you get from one point to the other? And this leads us to the idea of entropy, which was his fourth point, that a measure, it's basically information is a measure of disorder, particularly with heat and energy and thermodynamics. So this then looks forward to Wheeler, and this is why their ideas work together, is how do you handle that disorder, that disruption, that noise, that complexity, that entropy. So without going into a ton of things about Shannon, one of the things, Shannon was kind of left alone at Bell to kind of do research and development in a lot of different ways. Occasionally the CIA would come over and say, we need you to work on this, your work is classified, don't talk to anybody, including Turing, but you do good things. But one of the things that I thought was really funny was when I came across this in the manuscript division in the Shannon papers, and I don't know if you can really see it very well, but right where the yellow arrow is pointing, so this is a patent from Warren Shannon that was patented, and they were trying to figure out how do you work out all of this, the switching with the circuits and the logic gates and everything. So in between, you have closed and open. So a circuit is either open or closed. There is no in between. So right in between is don't care. So, he really didn't. He really didn't care. It had to be either open or closed, 0 or 1. That's what it was. So I want you to think back now just a little bit to when we were looking at Morse and Morse code. And if you look really hard, it needs to be a little bit bigger, you can see that here Shannon is really starting to understand modulation. How do you start to control that wavelength, which is the very top figure? How do you break it down? And then how do you handle the slowdown? And what do you do with entropy? So what do you do with that dissipation of heat and energy? You basically have it kick back into the message, which is what part of what makes packet switching work. And so it was interesting to see some of these things here. I just threw this in mostly because, well, one, we have the Lorenz papers here at the library, and I was dying to get more into these, but time didn't permit. But one of the things that Lorenz is really well known for, other than being a meteorologist, is chaos theory. And information theory made chaos theory possible. For those of you who aren't really familiar with chaos theory, Lorenz was known for this idea of the butterfly effect, that basically there would be one thing that would happen and be really small, and it could have great impact on a larger scale. So if you think about a butterfly flapping its wings, could it cause a major storm somewhere halfway around the world? And at first that seemed absolutely ridiculous. But as he kept doing his work as a meteorologist and trying to understand climate and patterns in climate, he kept coming into these things that reeked of the uncertainty principle and trying to understand patterns. It just started coming up with these patterns. And that's really what ended up happening with chaos theory, is that you started to understand patterns within something that looked absolutely chaotic. So again, kind of in the same time period, and now we're in the 21st century, obviously. Again, I just feel obligated to make a mention here of Mandelbrot, who is well known for his fractal geometry, but also was an icon at IBM. I'm going to explain this just really in a brief way, which is not at all going to do it justice. But basically, the idea is that if you look at this graphic here, which is paying homage to IBM with the stripes, many of us remember that graphic from years ago. In the middle, you see fractals. And you see this in biology and botany and chemistry and all different types of things. But the Mandelbrot set is visualized in that thing that almost looks like a heart, a really fat heart turned on its side. But what's really interesting about that is you can take this, which is a discrete finite set, that whole image right there, and have infinite versions of that all around the edges, all the way to the middle, and it will never touch. So you have basically infinity within a finite set. It's really incredible how this would work. But in order to really understand that and to make that known and to make it understood, how do you process all that data, which in a way kind of fast forwards us to big data of today, you needed to understand this type of mathematics, and it was done in a place where computers thrived. And we'll get back to him in just a minute. So if your brain is starting to glaze over because we've been talking about a lot of math and we've been talking a lot about circuits and electricity and all this stuff and I don't know what else to say, we'll look at something that's kind of different from that. So Vasarely was basically the father of op art, optical art. And the image you have that is gray and white, we'll say it that way, is here in the library's collections. And this book is also in this library's collections. It's actually a French poet, and he wrote an entire book of poetry on code, and he chose Vasarely to do the cover art for it because he could see how the mathematics lent itself to a codification of art. So again, it's starting to cross over into disciplines. It's starting to really resonate in popular culture. And I couldn't do this without just talking a little bit about our Eames collection. The image at the bottom is Ray Eames. She's a part of a design pair of Charles and Ray Eames. Charles was her husband. Library did a really wonderful exhibit. I think it predated my tenure here on them, but we are essentially their archive. And While I can't prove a correlation here, I think there's compelling visual interest between the image you see up at the top there that has sort of the golden background. That's basically a circuit board, and it was in the Eames's, what they called their curiosity cabinet. They would take pictures and they were slides and just things that would be inspiring to them, things that they found interesting. And then the larger image you see is Ray's abstract drawing for a dot pattern, and it is one of her most famous works of art, and you see the fabric design of it down at the bottom. The Eameses were also known for for a lot of different things, and again, we couldn't really cover all that today, but they were instrumental in the IBM's World Fair Pavilion in New York in 1964. They designed it. And so you see that there's, again, this sort of crossover of understanding of computer as art. They also did a historical history of computers and computing and really calculating machines in IBM's headquarters as well. And then they did some fantastic exhibits on Mathematica throughout the country. I think their most famous one was in California. And then just one last point about the Eameses, and I cut off their last name with that big image, sorry about that, is just the understanding of scale, and again, the idea of bits. In the Shannon papers, Shannon takes out a pencil and paper, starts to sketch out the idea of measures of information. And so it forms this pyramid, right? And so he starts from tens of bits and then goes to trillions. At the top of the pyramid was his estimate for the Library of Congress. It was 10 to the 14, or 100 trillion bits. Whether or not that's correct today, I don't know. I didn't want to go there, but I thought it was interesting that he thought about it. That was the largest container storehouse he could think of. If you compare that with the Eameses' work, they were doing film. They were doing all sorts of things, photography, original art. And this is their poster that has all of the stills of what was called powers of 10 and dealing with the relative size of things in the universe and the effect of adding yet another 0, powers of 10. It was then put into a motion picture, and it was used for educational purposes in this country and elsewhere. Okay, home stretch. So just to fast forward a little bit more, we really can't omit the University of Utah here. And the Library of Congress periodically announces the National Film Registry, and I was excited, in fact ecstatic, when they announced the one for a computer animated hand. The image you see there of the hand it really is a short, but it was the first three-dimensional computer animated graphic ever created. And what's particularly interesting about this is that the people who did it, Edwin Catmull and Jeff Park, went on to co-found Pixar. Anybody know what Pixar is? Yeah, I see some people nodding. They were backed by George Lucas and Lucasfilm and ILM, and then they eventually partnered with Steve Jobs again to form Pixar. And then around the same time, only 3 years later, you had Martin Newell do the math, essentially, for what's called the Utah Teapot, which almost anybody doing graphic design has to learn how to do. It is painful and yet educational all at the same time. So why I have the next two movies on this slide is twofold. Again, the Toy Story is a nod to Catmull, because Pixar's very first full-length feature, completely CGI, completely computer-generated imagery, was Toy Story, and that was in 1995. So it was, almost 20 years later. But more recently after that short was Future World, and that was a series. And I watched it over in the MBRS reading room You know, it's kind of like a cult flick, I would just say. You kind of have to be diehard to sit through the whole thing. It really wasn't that bad. It was Peter Fonda and Blythe Danner and Yul Brynner. Yul Brynner had no speaking parts in it whatsoever. But this short film of the computer animated hand was featured in that full-length feature film. And it was kind of creepy and eerie and kind of got into this whole idea of robotics taking over the world. And I'm proud to say the people eventually saved the day. But you know, you're really seeing the advances, even though they're slow, they're also fast at the same time. It's kind of its own binary opposition, if you will. Okay, so where does this leave us? Oh, actually, let me just make one more mention of something here. I would be remiss if I didn't mention one other thing about Pixar. So you saw what Catmull did with Park in creating that computer animated hand. And you saw what they did with Pixar. What we didn't show here was their work in creating new software for computers that is, I wasn't going to use the word, but I basically have to at this point. It's ubiquitous. Most of the major films that you see that have CGI involved in them now are utilizing RenderMan. RenderMan was created by Pixar, and all of those really great graphics that look so real. Anybody, you know, watch The Hobbit and Gollum and, you know, Precious. And when you look at the mountains and how realistic they are, anybody a Star Wars fan, you know, saw all the graphics in that. All of those graphics that look so detailed were using the fractal geometry that Mandelbrot used. So it comes full circle. You know, it really, what was originally created as math and physics inspired art, the art then inspired the computer engineering, essentially, software engineering. So where does this leave us? I think that's up to you to decide in many ways from bit, but I'm going to leave it with this note and sort of a nod, and I don't know if our esteemed chair Nathaniel Comfort is here, but not too long ago we had a really interesting presentation about the RNA world, and it was there that some of the you know, seminal people who understood RNA mentioned that DNA wasn't very interesting. They might find that this was interesting. Francis Crick, who left physics for biology, and James Watson were the people who essentially discovered DNA, and they wrote to Schroeder and Gamow and Hofstadter and others, making the connection that genetic code was the information system from which all continuity of life stems. So I thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. The question is about whether or not the universe is essentially analog or digital, and what about fuzzy logic and how it fits in there. Fuzzy logic is weird. It's what I can tell you about fuzzy logic. I think you can do a lot of different things with fuzzy logic that would allow you to argue both sides of this theory. Whether it's analog or digital, I don't think it's, if I answer this from a Wheeler perspective, what I think he might say is it's neither, because it's the most granular, for lack of a better word, part of existence. It is the very essence of the whole and the part. So it can't be, because it's binary, because it's two halves of a whole, essentially, it can't be analog and it can't just be digital. It's it from bit. So the question was about, you know, basically how information was being shared at different parts throughout the research project. And if I look at it back at sort of the earlier points where we had the I Ching and we had, you know, the Mangarevan Islands and those type of things, you know, part of it is how people move around the earth, right? So you have people who emigrated to a place and they had to come up with a scheme. The Mangarevans came up with their own, and it was kind of unique, even among French Polynesian islands. And this predated colonialism. But then when you had colonialism coming, you had Oftentimes, in the cases that I was using, priests that were sent out to convert people, but also were informed of ideas of the cultures in which they were living. And so we saw that with Beauvais, with Leibniz. Then, I think things changed because the world became more globally aware. And so I think one of the things that we saw with the telegraph is that you had not just your local town crier, and you didn't have somebody on a horseback, and you didn't have lanterns, one if by land, two if by sea. You had something that was much more immediate, and that definitely became transcontinental. And leading up to that and after that, you had these really fantastic planned events, these world fairs that really drew hordes of people and were fantastic in their inspiration of innovation and cultural exchange. When you get into the electronic time period, moving a little bit forward and where computers really start to be connected, where you have ARPANET and you actually have an intranet, it becomes a much different animal about how information is communicated because it's much more immediate. I mean, we all see it. We're all checking our phones, every 5 seconds to see what the little ping was on our phone. You have the advent of motion pictures and that kind of thing. So it's a very different type of communication of information. Thank you for your question. So the question is basically wondering whether or not, if there were sort of dissenters about this idea of binary and whether it was impoverished and really just didn't seem like a good idea at all. Is that maybe a way to characterize it, skeptics? Yeah, I think you always have them. You always have people who say, this is not at all the way we want to go. And frankly, you saw that in the writing. Tesla was arguing that in the newspaper article, saying, this is crazy. People saying that this is not possible. It's possible. We've demonstrated it. We're, building examples of it. And 3 years later, there was another person working on it. And a few years after that, there was a working prototype. So, the proof was in the pudding, so to speak. People were able to create their inventions. They were inspired by some of these ideas. And they were able to demonstrate that they worked. And they were able to overcome the challenges of things like entropy, complexity, noise, the whole dynamical system kind of concept. So, yeah, I think you always have those dissenters, but if you can prove it, then more power to you.
I think with that, we'll have to stop there. So please join me again in thanking Jennifer.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.